The fine notice arrived on my doorstep on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, and I nearly spit out my coffee when I read the amount. $1,500 for unauthorized winter decorations. My name is Yates Thompson, and I've lived in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in Naperville, Illinois, for the past 8 years. I'd served on the Homeowners Association Decorations Committee for the last 3 of those years, and I distinctly remembered sitting in that very committee meeting where we'd approved the new winter decoration guidelines. In fact, I'd been one of the people who'd actually written them. I stood there in my driveway, still in my bathrobe, despite it being nearly 9 in the morning, staring at the notice like it might suddenly make sense if I just looked at it hard enough. The letter was printed on official HOA letterhead, signed by someone named Brenda Sheffield, who apparently held the title of HOA Compliance Officer. I'd never heard of Brenda Sheffield in my life, and I'd certainly never heard of a position called Compliance Officer. We had a president, a vice president, a secretary, and various committee heads, but no one had ever mentioned creating this new role. The specific violation listed was excessive and unapproved illuminated decorations extending beyond approved parameters, as outlined in Section 4.2 of the HOA Winter Display Guidelines. I walked down to the end of my driveway and turned around to look at my house. The decorations in question were actually pretty modest by most standards. I had white icicle lights hanging from the gutters, a tasteful wreath on the front door, 2 illuminated deer in the front yard, and a projected snowflake pattern on the garage door. Everything was white and blue, following what I thought were the exact specifications we'd approved in committee. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus Chen, who served as president of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. We'd been neighbors for years, and our kids had played together when they were younger. Marcus answered on the 3rd ring, sounding distracted. "Yates, hey, what's up?" he said, and I could hear him typing in the background. "Marcus, I just got a $1,500 fine for my winter decorations. What the hell is going on?" The typing stopped. "You what?" "Yeah, from someone named Brenda Sheffield, compliance officer. Ring any bells?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Brenda Sheffield moved into the neighborhood about 4 months ago. She's been very vocal at the monthly meetings. You haven't been to the last few, have you?" I felt a pang of guilt. Between work deadlines and my daughter's basketball season ramping up, I'd missed the last 3 monthly HOA meetings. "I've been swamped, but Marcus, I'm on the decorations committee. How can I get fined for decorations that follow the guidelines we approved? I need to look into this." "Let me call you back." He hung up before I could respond. I went inside, finally getting dressed and trying to shake off the irritation that was building in my chest. My wife, Sarah, had already left for work at the hospital, so I texted her about the situation. She responded immediately with 3 angry face emojis and a message saying we should fight it. 20 minutes later, Marcus called back. "Okay, so here's the situation. After you missed those meetings, Brenda proposed creating a new compliance officer position to help enforce HOA rules more consistently. She volunteered for the role, and it passed. And nobody thought to maybe check with the actual committee members before sending out fines. She's been sending out a lot of notices lately. I've gotten some complaints, but technically she's within her authority. The board approved her to enforce the rules as written. But Marcus, I helped write these rules. My decorations are completely compliant. Can you come to the office tomorrow? Let's sit down with the documentation and figure this out." The HOA office was actually just a converted bedroom in Marcus's house that he used for association business. I agreed to meet him there the next morning at 10. After we hung up, I went to my home office and dug through my files until I found my copy of the winter display guidelines we'd drafted and approved the previous February. I read through them carefully, checking each specification against my current decorations. According to Section 4.2, residents were permitted to display illuminated winter decorations between November 15th and January 15th. The decorations could include icicle lights, provided they were white or blue. Yard displays were allowed as long as they didn't exceed 6 feet in height and were positioned at least 3 feet from the property line. Projected displays were explicitly approved as long as they were tasteful and non-commercial in appearance. My decorations met every single criterion. I took photos of everything, printed out my copy of the guidelines, and spent the rest of the day fuming about the situation. That evening at dinner, my 15-year-old daughter Emma asked why I seemed so distracted. "Just some HOA nonsense," I told her. "Nothing to worry about." "Is it about the Christmas lights?" Because Melissa's mom was saying something at practice about how some lady was going around giving people tickets for their decorations. I set down my fork. "Melissa's mom got a fine too." "I think so. She was really mad about it." Melissa's family lived 3 streets over. I made a mental note to reach out to them. If Brenda was issuing multiple fines, this was bigger than just my situation. The next morning, I arrived at Marcus's house at 10 sharp. He let me into the HOA office, which was cramped with filing cabinets and a desk that looked like it had been salvaged from a 1990s corporate office. Marcus looked tired, his usually neat hair slightly disheveled. "Coffee," he offered, gesturing to a pot brewing in the corner. "Definitely." He poured us both cups and we sat down. Marcus pulled out a folder that was already sitting on the desk. "So I did some digging last night. Brenda has issued 47 violation notices in the past month alone." 47? For what? Everything. Decorations, lawn height, trash can placement, exterior paint colors, mailbox styles. She's been very thorough. Marcus's tone suggested he wasn't thrilled about this either. But has anyone challenged these fines? Because Marcus, my decorations are completely by the book. I have the guidelines right here. I pulled out my printed copy and slid it across the desk. Marcus picked it up and started reading. As he did, his frown deepened. "These are the approved guidelines. I have the master copy here." He opened a filing cabinet and pulled out an identical document. "Your decorations comply with everything here." "So what's Brenda's problem?" She says she's using an updated version of the guidelines. "Updated? By who? The decorations committee hasn't met since September and we didn't discuss any changes then." Marcus rubbed his face. "That's the issue. Brenda apparently drafted her own updated guidelines and started enforcing them without getting committee approval." I felt my blood pressure rising. "She can't do that. That's not how this works." "I know. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow night. We need to address this before it gets even more out of hand. I've already gotten calls from 8 other residents who have received fines. Count me in. And Marcus, I want a formal retraction of my fine and a written apology." "I'll do what I can. But Yates, be prepared. Brenda is very persistent. She's going to fight this." I left Marcus's house feeling slightly better but still annoyed. On my way home, I stopped at the Dunkin' Donuts on Route 59 and ran into Greg Morrison, another neighbor who lived on my street. He was coming out as I was going in and he flagged me down. "Yates, hold up. Did you get one of those violation notices from the HOA?" "Sure did. $1,500 for my winter decorations." Greg shook his head. "I got hit for $1,200. Apparently my wreath is too large and my lights are the wrong color temperature." "Wrong color temperature?" "Yeah, she says they need to be warm white, not cool white. Except the approved guidelines don't specify color temperature at all, just that they can be white or blue. We stood there in the parking lot for a few minutes, comparing notes. Greg told me he'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Brenda had been taking measurements and photos of everyone's decorations, building files on each violation. It sounded obsessive. "You're on the decorations committee, right?" Greg asked. "Yeah, have been for 3 years. So fight this thing. A lot of us are counting on you." The weight of that statement settled on me as I drove home. This wasn't just about my fine anymore. Brenda had apparently decided to wage a one-woman war against the neighborhood, and people were looking to me to help stop it. That evening, I called Jennifer Walsh, who chaired the decorations committee. Jennifer lived in the newer section of Meadowbrook Heights and was known for her meticulous attention to detail, which made her perfect for the role. She answered quickly, and I could immediately tell she was agitated. "Yates, thank God you called. Have you heard what's been happening? I got a fine myself. Marcus says there's an emergency board meeting tomorrow night." "Good, because this is absolutely insane. I've had 6 committee members contact me about fines." "Committee members, Yates. People who helped create the guidelines are being told they're in violation of them." "You know Brenda Sheffield personally?" Jennifer sighed. "Met her once at a monthly meeting. She seemed nice enough at first, very enthusiastic about community standards and property values. But then she started suggesting we needed stricter enforcement, more detailed rules, higher fines for violations. When I explained that our committee tries to balance community standards with reasonable freedom for homeowners, she got very defensive. Said we were being too permissive and that it was hurting everyone's property values. So she created her own position and started enforcing rules that don't exist, apparently. Marcus showed me some of her revised guidelines. They're ridiculous. She's added restrictions on the types of decorations allowed, specific measurements for everything, and eliminated most of the flexibility we'd built into the original rules. We talked for another 20 minutes, strategizing for the board meeting. Jennifer agreed to bring all the original documentation and to have as many committee members as possible attend the meeting to present a united front. The next evening, I walked into the Meadowbrook Heights Community Center at 7 o'clock sharp. The community center was a modest building near the neighborhood entrance, typically used for events like the annual summer picnic or the neighborhood garage sale coordination meetings. Tonight, the main room was packed. I counted at least 60 people, all of whom looked angry. Marcus stood at the front of the room with the other board members. Vice President Patricia Williams, Secretary Thomas Greenfield, and Treasurer Deanne Robertson. And there, standing slightly apart from them, was a woman I immediately pegged as Brenda Sheffield. Brenda was probably in her late 40s, with blonde hair cut in a severe bob and wearing a blazer that looked too formal for a neighborhood HOA meeting. She had a large binder tucked under one arm and an expression of supreme confidence on her face. She caught me looking at her and gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. "I know many of you are here because of violation notices you've received recently. We're going to address this situation tonight and come to a resolution." "There's nothing to resolve," Brenda said, stepping forward. "I've been enforcing the HOA rules as written. If people don't like receiving violations, they should follow the guidelines." "The problem, Brenda," Jennifer Walsh said, standing up from her seat in the 3rd row, "is that you're not enforcing the rules as written. You're enforcing your own made-up version of the rules." Brenda's smile vanished. "I've simply clarified ambiguous language in the existing guidelines to ensure consistent enforcement." "You don't have the authority to clarify anything," I said, standing up. I'm on the decorations committee. We write the guidelines and the board approves them. You don't get to modify them unilaterally. And you are, Brenda asked, though her tone suggested she knew exactly who I was. Yates Thompson. I received a $1,500 fine for decorations that comply with every specification in the approved guidelines. Your decorations violate the updated standards for display size and illumination intensity. There are no updated standards, Jennifer interjected. The committee hasn't met to discuss any updates and the board hasn't approved any changes. Brenda opened her binder and pulled out a stapled document. I submitted my proposed updates to the board 6 weeks ago. When I didn't hear any objections, I assumed they were approved and began enforcement. Marcus looked pained. Brenda, that's not how this works. Just because no one responded doesn't mean your changes were approved. Any modifications to HOA guidelines require a formal vote by the relevant committee and then approval by the full board. Well, that's an inefficient system that allows outdated rules to persist indefinitely. It's called due process, Thomas Greenfield said. The secretary was a lawyer by profession, and his voice had taken on a sharp edge. And it's required by our HOA bylaws. Any violations issued under these unauthorized guidelines are invalid. Brenda's face flushed. I've spent dozens of hours documenting violations and maintaining community standards. Are you telling me that was all for nothing? We're telling you that you overstepped your authority, Patricia Williams said gently. The compliance officer position was created to help enforce existing rules, not to create new ones. The room had gone silent, everyone watching the confrontation unfold. I glanced around and saw Greg Morrison and several other fine recipients leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. So what happens to the fines? Someone called from the back. Marcus looked at the other board members, and they seemed to have a silent conversation. Finally, he said, all fines issued by Brenda Sheffield under the unauthorized updated guidelines are hereby voided. Residents will receive written notification of this within 48 hours. A cheer went up from the crowd. Brenda looked like she'd been slapped. You can't do this. I followed proper procedure. You didn't, Thomas said firmly. And if you'd attended committee meetings or consulted with committee chairs before taking action, you would have known that. This is exactly the kind of lax attitude that leads to declining property values, Brenda snapped. I've seen it happen in other neighborhoods. People start letting their properties go, and before you know it, everyone's home is worth 20% less. Brenda, having cool white lights instead of warm white lights isn't going to tank property values, Jennifer said. You're being unreasonable. I'm being thorough. Maybe if this committee and this board took their responsibilities seriously, I wouldn't have to do their jobs for them. The room erupted in angry voices. Multiple people shouted at once, defending the board and the committee. Marcus banged a gavel, calling for order. This meeting is getting out of hand, he said. Let's take a 10-minute break. Board members and committee chairs, please meet me in the side office. I followed Marcus and the others into a smaller room off the main hall. Once the door was closed, Patricia spoke first. We need to remove her from the compliance officer position. This is untenable. Can we do that? Deanne asked. What are the rules around removing someone from an appointed position? Thomas pulled out his phone and started scrolling through something. According to the bylaws, any appointed position can be terminated by a majority vote of the board. We'd need to give her notice and allow her to speak in her defense, but yes, we can remove her. I don't think we have a choice, Marcus said. She's acting outside her authority and alienating the entire neighborhood. This can't continue. Jennifer raised a concern. What if she escalates? Some people get vindictive when they feel wronged. We'll cross that bridge if we come to it, Marcus said. Right now, we need to restore order and confidence in the HOA. That means removing Brenda from her position and making it clear that the existing, properly approved guidelines are the only ones we're enforcing. We returned to the main room, and Marcus announced that the board would be holding a vote at the next official board meeting to review the compliance officer position. He didn't explicitly say Brenda would be removed, but the implication was clear. Brenda gathered her belongings and left without another word, her face rigid with anger. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to thank me for speaking up. Greg Morrison clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good job, man. We need more people willing to stand up to this kind of nonsense." I drove home feeling satisfied but also uneasy. Something about the look on Brenda's face as she'd left worried me. She didn't seem like someone who would just accept defeat and move on. I was right to be worried. 3 days later, I came home from work to find a notice taped to my front door. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from the City of Naperville Code Enforcement Division, citing me for multiple violations of city ordinances related to holiday displays. According to the notice, my decorations exceeded the allowed wattage for residential displays. My illuminated deer were positioned too close to the sidewalk and created a pedestrian hazard. And my projected snowflake display was creating a public nuisance by reflecting onto the street. I read the notice 3 times, my disbelief growing with each pass. These claims were absurd. My decorations used LED lights that consumed minimal power. The deer were a good 5 feet from the sidewalk, and the snowflake projection was aimed directly at my garage door with no spillover onto the street. I called Marcus immediately. "Please tell me other people are getting city code enforcement notices." 6 calls so far, all people who spoke up at the board meeting. "Yates, I think Brenda is filing false complaints with the city." "Can she do that?" "Technically, anyone can file a complaint. The city is obligated to investigate, but if the complaints are baseless, they'll be dismissed after inspection." This is insane. She's wasting city resources because she's mad about losing her made-up authority. It looks that way. I'm going to document all of this. If we can prove she's filing false complaints, that's actually illegal. We might be able to pursue charges. The city inspector showed up 2 days later, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Frank Rodriguez. He spent about 10 minutes examining my decorations, taking measurements and reviewing the complaint. Finally, he shook his head. "Mr. Thompson, I don't see any violations here. Your lights are low-wattage LEDs, the yard decorations are properly positioned, and the projection isn't causing any issues. I'm closing this complaint as unfounded." "Can I ask who filed the complaint?" Frank checked his clipboard. "It was submitted anonymously through the online portal, but the IP address is logged. If you want to pursue this further, you could file a counter-complaint for false reporting." I might do that. After Frank left, I called Marcus back and told him what the inspector had said. Marcus had received similar news from other residents. Every single complaint had been found to be baseless. "That's 8 false complaints filed with the city," Marcus said. "I talked to Thomas, and he says that's enough to potentially file a police report for harassment and filing false reports. The question is, do we want to escalate this to criminal charges?" I thought about it. Part of me wanted to just let it go. The fines were voided, the city had dismissed the complaints, and Brenda would be removed from her position at the next board meeting. But another part of me, the part that was angry about being harassed and having my time wasted, wanted to see consequences. "Let's at least document it with the police," I said. "Even if we don't press charges, there should be a record in case she does this to someone else in the future." Marcus agreed. The next day, he, Jennifer, and I went to the Naperville Police Department and filed a report. The officer who took our statement, a young woman named Officer Lisa Chen, listened carefully and took detailed notes. Unfortunately, filing false reports with city code enforcement is a gray area, she said. It's not quite the same as filing a false police report, which is clearly criminal. But the harassment angle is worth documenting. If this person escalates to property damage or threats, we'll have this on record. We left the police station feeling like we'd done what we could. The board meeting to vote on Brenda's removal was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and I planned to be there. That weekend, something happened that changed everything. On Saturday morning, I was out front raking leaves from the flower beds when Brenda's husband pulled into their driveway 3 houses down. I'd never formally met him, but I'd seen him around the neighborhood. He was a tall man with graying hair, usually dressed in business casual attire. Today, he looked haggard. He got out of his car and started unloading boxes, and I realized with a start that they were personal belongings. As I watched, Brenda came out of the house, and even from a distance I could hear them arguing. Their voices carried across the quiet Saturday morning, harsh and bitter. I turned away, not wanting to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help catching fragments. Something about obsession, something about embarrassment, something about therapy. The husband loaded the boxes into his car and drove away. Brenda stood in the driveway for a long moment before going back inside. I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Whatever was happening in Brenda's personal life clearly wasn't good, and I wondered if that stress had contributed to her extreme behavior with the HOA. That evening, Sarah and I were having dinner when Emma mentioned that she'd heard at school that Brenda Sheffield's son had gotten suspended for fighting. Apparently, he'd punched another kid who'd made a joke about his mom being the neighborhood dictator. That's really sad, Sarah said. I mean, yes, she's been completely out of line, but her family shouldn't have to suffer for it. I agree, I said, though I wasn't sure what we could do about it. Brenda had brought this on herself through her actions, but the collateral damage was unfortunate. The board meeting on Tuesday was sparsely attended compared to the previous emergency meeting. Maybe 20 people showed up, mostly board members, committee chairs, and a few residents who'd been directly affected by Brenda's actions. Brenda herself arrived exactly at 7 o'clock, looking composed but tired. Marcus called the meeting to order and moved directly to the agenda item everyone was there for: the review of the compliance officer position and Brenda Sheffield's appointment to it. Brenda, you have the floor to speak in your defense before the board votes, Marcus said. Brenda stood up, and for a moment I thought she might actually apologize or try to explain herself. Instead, she doubled down. I stand by everything I've done, she said, her voice steady. This neighborhood has become too lax in enforcing its standards, and property values will suffer as a result. I've lived in communities that went downhill because no one was willing to maintain standards, and I refuse to let that happen here. If you remove me from this position, you're making a mistake that you'll regret. Jennifer raised her hand. Brenda, do you acknowledge that you enforced guidelines that were never officially approved? I improved guidelines that were inadequate. That's not your role, Thomas said. You were appointed to enforce existing rules, not to create new ones. You violated the basic structure of how this HOA operates. Maybe that structure is the problem. Patricia shook her head. Brenda, I appreciate your passion for the community, but you have to work within the system. You can't just decide that the rules don't apply to you. I've never thought the rules don't apply to me. I've thought the rules were insufficient, and I took action to correct that. The board members looked at each other, and Marcus called for the vote. It was unanimous. Brenda was removed from the compliance officer position, effective immediately. Moreover, the board voted to dissolve the position entirely, returning to the previous system of committee-based enforcement. Brenda gathered her things silently and walked out. As she passed my seat, she looked directly at me, and the expression on her face sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder and more calculating. Over the next few days, things seemed to settle down. The HOA sent out letters officially voiding all of Brenda's fines and apologizing for the confusion. The Decorations Committee scheduled a meeting in January to review the existing guidelines and consider whether any updates were actually needed, with proper process this time. I started to think the whole situation was behind us. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas, I woke up to find my front yard decorations destroyed. The illuminated deer had been knocked over and smashed, pieces of plastic scattered across the lawn. The icicle lights had been torn down from the gutters, many of the bulbs broken. The wreath on my front door had been ripped in half. Even the projected snowflake display had been vandalized, the projector smashed on the driveway. Sarah came out in her bathrobe and gasped when she saw the damage. "Oh my God, who would do this?" I pulled out my phone and called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, I walked around the yard, taking photos of everything. The destruction was thorough and deliberate. This wasn't random teenage vandalism. Someone had spent time methodically destroying each decoration. Officer Chen arrived, the same officer who'd taken our report about the false code enforcement complaints. She walked through the yard with me, examining the damage. "You have any security cameras?" she asked. "Just a doorbell camera, but it's aimed at the front door. It might have caught something." We went inside and reviewed the footage. At 3:15 in the morning, a figure dressed in dark clothing and wearing a ski mask had entered the yard and spent approximately 12 minutes destroying the decorations. The camera angle wasn't good enough to identify the person definitively, but I could tell from the build and movements that it was likely a woman. "Can you think of anyone who might want to do this to you?" Officer Chen asked, though her tone suggested she already had an idea. "Brenda Sheffield lives 3 houses down. She's the one we filed the report about for the false complaints." "I remember. Have you had any direct contact with her since that report was filed?" "Not really. I saw her at the board meeting where she was removed from her position, but we didn't speak." Officer Chen made notes in her report. "I'm going to go talk to Mr. Sheffield. Based on the timing, motive, and your previous report, we have grounds to investigate." She left, and I spent the next hour cleaning up the debris while Sarah called our insurance company. Emma came downstairs and immediately teared up when she saw what had happened. "This is so messed up," she said. "Why would someone do this?" "Some people don't handle rejection well," I told her, which felt like a massive understatement. Officer Chen returned about 90 minutes later with a grim expression. "Mr. Thompson, can we talk privately?" We went into my home office and she closed the door. I spoke with Brenda Sheffield. She denied any involvement and said she was home asleep during the time of the incident. However, her husband, who's apparently been staying at a hotel since they separated, said she's been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. He was willing to provide a statement. So what happens now? We need more evidence before we can make an arrest. The doorbell footage isn't clear enough for a positive identification. Do any of your neighbors have cameras that might have caught her entering or leaving your property? I thought about it. The Hendersons next door have a camera system. And I think the Patels across the street do too. I'll canvass the neighbors and collect any footage they have. In the meantime, I'd recommend installing additional security cameras and documenting any further contact or harassment from Mr. Sheffield. Over the next 2 days, Officer Chen collected footage from 4 different neighbors' security systems. The combined footage painted a clear picture. At 3:05 a.m., Brenda Sheffield had left her house on foot, walked down to my property, destroyed the decorations, and returned home. While she'd been wearing a ski mask during the actual vandalism, the footage of her leaving and returning to her house showed her face clearly in the streetlight. Officer Chen came to my house with a warrant for Brenda's arrest. I watched from my window as she and another officer knocked on Brenda's door. Brenda answered, still in her pajamas, and even from a distance, I could see the moment she realized why they were there. Her shoulders slumped, and she seemed to age 10 years in an instant. They arrested her right there in her doorway, handcuffing her and leading her to the patrol car. Several neighbors came out of their houses to watch, including Greg Morrison, who walked over to stand with me in my driveway. "Damn," he said quietly. "She really went off the deep end." "Yeah." I felt a complicated mix of emotions watching Brenda be driven away. Satisfaction that there would be consequences for what she'd done, but also sadness that things had escalated to this point. Whatever had been going on in her life, she'd made terrible choices in how she handled it. The legal process moved surprisingly quickly. Brenda was charged with criminal mischief and trespassing. Her lawyer tried to argue for a mental health defense, presenting evidence that she'd been under extreme stress from her marital separation and had been acting out of character. The prosecutor, however, pointed to the pattern of behavior: the unauthorized HOA enforcement, the false code enforcement complaints, and finally the property destruction. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was an escalating pattern of harassment. In mid-January, Brenda pleaded guilty to the charges as part of a plea deal. She was sentenced to 6 months of probation, ordered to pay restitution for the damaged decorations, required to attend anger management counseling, and issued a restraining order preventing her from coming within 100 feet of my property. Marcus called me after the sentencing to fill me in on some additional developments. Brenda and her husband finalized their separation. He's filing for divorce, and they've put their house on the market. She's moving out of the neighborhood. How's their son doing? Not great, from what I hear. He's seeing a counselor at school. The whole thing has been really hard on him. I felt genuinely bad about that. The kid hadn't done anything wrong, but he was paying a price for his mother's actions. That same week, the HOA held its regular January meeting, and I made sure to attend. The board officially dissolved the compliance officer position and passed a resolution requiring any new positions or significant rule changes to go through a formal proposal and voting process with at least 30 days' notice to all residents. Jennifer Walsh announced that the Decorations Committee would be meeting the following week to review the winter display guidelines. "And we'll be making sure the process is open and transparent," she said, looking meaningfully at the assembled residents. "Anyone who wants to participate is welcome to attend and provide input." The meeting adjourned, and I walked out with Marcus. We stood in the parking lot for a moment, both of us quiet. "Hell of a few weeks," Marcus said finally. "Yeah. You know, I've lived here 8 years and I've mostly enjoyed it. Good schools, nice neighbors, reasonable HOA. This whole thing with Brenda was just bizarre. It was a perfect storm of personal stress, control issues, and lack of oversight. We should have been more careful about creating that compliance officer position in the first place. It gave one person too much authority without adequate checks and balances." "Live and learn, I guess." Marcus nodded. "At least it's over now. Things can get back to normal." I went home and told Sarah everything that had happened. She listened quietly, then said, "I feel bad for her, honestly. She obviously has some serious issues. I hope she gets the help she needs." "Me too." That weekend, I went to Home Depot and bought new decorations to replace the ones that had been destroyed. I also installed a proper security camera system, covering all angles of the yard and driveway. Sarah teased me about being paranoid, but after what had happened, I wanted the peace of mind. Emma helped me put up the new decorations, which were similar to the original ones but slightly different. I found a new set of illuminated deer, this time made of metal instead of plastic. The icicle lights were the same warm white color. I hung a fresh wreath on the door and set up a new snowflake projector. When we finished, Emma and I stood at the end of the driveway to admire the work. The lights twinkled in the late afternoon gloom, cheerful and welcoming. "Looks good, Dad," Emma said. "Thanks for helping." "Are you going to put up decorations next year?" I thought about it. Part of me wanted to say no to avoid any future drama, but the rational part of my brain knew that would be letting Brenda's behavior win, even after everything was resolved. "Yeah," I said. "I'm definitely putting up decorations next year." The rest of December passed uneventfully. Christmas came and went, filled with family gatherings and too much food. Emma's basketball team made it to the regional playoffs. Sarah's hospital promoted her to head nurse in the pediatric unit. Life moved on. In early February, I attended the decorations committee meeting where we formally reviewed the winter display guidelines. About 15 residents showed up, including several people I didn't recognize. Jennifer ran the meeting efficiently, going through each section of the existing guidelines and asking for feedback. The consensus was that the guidelines were actually fine as they were. They provided enough structure to maintain a cohesive neighborhood aesthetic while allowing for individual expression. We made a few minor clarifications, mostly just cleaning up ambiguous wording that could be misinterpreted, and voted to approve the updated version. The board ratified the changes at the next monthly meeting. Marcus pulled me aside after the board meeting. "There's something I wanted to run by you. The compliance officer position is dissolved, but we still need better enforcement mechanisms for actual violations." I was thinking about creating a rotating enforcement role, where a different board member takes on that responsibility each quarter. What do you think? I think it's a good idea. Spreading the responsibility around prevents any one person from getting too invested in it or wielding too much power. That's what I was thinking. Would you be willing to serve on the board? Patricia is stepping down at the end of the year and we'll need a new vice president. I was surprised by the offer. I'd never really considered serving on the board itself, as opposed to just being on a committee. "Can I think about it, of course? Let me know by the spring elections." I went home and discussed it with Sarah. She was supportive but practical. "You'd need to be able to commit the time. Between work and Emma's activities, would you be able to handle board responsibilities?" "I think so. Emma's getting older and doesn't need as much hands-on parenting, and I could adjust my work schedule a bit. I just need to think about whether I actually want to do it." Over the next few weeks, I mulled over Marcus's offer. Part of me was hesitant because of everything that had happened with Brenda. The whole situation had left a bad taste in my mouth about HOA politics, but another part of me felt a sense of responsibility. I'd lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 8 years. My daughter had grown up here. I'd benefited from the work of the HOA in maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and keeping the neighborhood safe and pleasant. Maybe it was time to step up and contribute more directly. In late March, I told Marcus I'd accept the nomination for vice president. The election was held in April, and I won with about 65% of the vote. My main opponent was a nice woman named Cheryl who lived in the new section, and she took the loss gracefully, even offering to help with whatever I needed. My first official act as vice president was to help implement the rotating enforcement system Marcus had proposed. We assigned each board member a 3-month rotation, with clear guidelines about what they could and couldn't do. Any enforcement action had to be documented and reported to the full board, and homeowners had a clear appeals process. It was more bureaucratic than the compliance officer role had been, but it was also much harder to abuse. Spring turned to summer, and Meadowbrook Heights settled into its usual rhythm. The annual garage sale happened in May, the neighborhood pool opened in June, and the 4th of July picnic was the best attended in years. Emma finished her sophomore year with excellent grades and a starting position on the varsity basketball team for the fall. In July, I was mowing the front lawn when a moving truck pulled up 3 houses down. New neighbors were moving into Brenda's old house. I walked over to introduce myself and met the Whitman family, newly relocated from Seattle for the husband's job in Chicago. They had 2 young kids and seemed friendly and normal. "How's the neighborhood?" Mr. Whitman asked as we shook hands. "Any strange HOA rules we should know about?" I laughed. "The HOA is pretty reasonable, actually. We've got guidelines for things like lawn maintenance and decorations, but nothing too restrictive. If you have questions, just reach out. I'm actually the vice president now." "Good to know. We'll definitely take you up on that." As I walked back to my house, I reflected on how much had changed in less than a year. The crisis with Brenda had exposed weaknesses in our HOA system, but it had also pushed us to fix those weaknesses and create better processes. The neighborhood was stronger for having gone through it. That doesn't mean I'd want to repeat the experience. Dealing with Brenda's escalating behavior had been stressful and time-consuming, and the property damage had been genuinely upsetting. But we'd handled it, both as a community and through the appropriate legal channels. Brenda had faced consequences for her actions, and we'd all learned something about the importance of proper oversight and accountability. In October, the Decorations Committee met to start discussing winter display guidelines for the upcoming season. I attended as the board liaison, my new official role. Jennifer ran the meeting with her usual efficiency, and we reviewed the updated guidelines we'd approved back in February. "Any other changes anyone wants to propose?" Jennifer asked, looking around the table. Silence. Everyone seemed satisfied with the current rules. "Great," Jennifer said. "Then I move we keep the existing guidelines in place for this year." The motion passed unanimously. Simple, straightforward, and drama-free, exactly how it should be. November arrived and I started planning my winter decorations. Sarah suggested I keep it simple this year, maybe just lights and a wreath, but I decided to go all out. I bought new illuminated deer, added some lighted snowflake decorations, hung multicolored icicle lights, and even got an inflatable snowman for the front yard. Everything was within the guidelines, of course, but I made sure it was noticeable. Emma laughed when she saw the final result. "Dad, are you trying to prove a point?" "Maybe a little, but mostly I just like the decorations." Marcus stopped by that evening and gave my display an exaggerated inspection, pretending to take measurements and check color temperatures. "I don't know, Yates. This snowman looks like it might be half an inch over the height limit. I'm going to have to issue you a violation." "Don't even joke about that." We both laughed, and Marcus headed home. I stood in my driveway, looking at the lights twinkling in the early winter darkness. Down the street, I could see other houses putting up their own decorations, each one different but all of them contributing to a festive, welcoming atmosphere. This was what a neighborhood should be. People living their lives, expressing themselves within reasonable boundaries, and working together to maintain a community they could all be proud of. Not everyone needed to agree on everything, but everyone needed to respect the process and each other. The following week, the HOA sent out its annual reminder about winter display guidelines, encouraging residents to decorate while following the approved rules. The email included a link to the full guidelines, contact information for the decorations committee, and a reminder about the appeals process for anyone who received a violation notice. I didn't receive any violation notices, and neither did anyone else in my immediate area. The rotating enforcement system was working well. The board member currently assigned to enforcement duties, Deanne Robertson, took her job seriously but not personally. When she did issue violations, they were for clear, obvious infractions, and she made sure to include information about how to come into compliance. Christmas came and went, another wonderful holiday with family and friends. Emma got into her top-choice college, which meant we'd be empty nesters in a couple of years. Sarah and I talked about what we wanted to do with that new phase of life, maybe travel more, maybe finally renovate the kitchen. On January 14th, the day before decorations were supposed to come down according to the guidelines, I spent the afternoon carefully removing everything and packing it away in labeled boxes in the garage. Emma helped again, and we worked in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on the decorations or random topics. "Are you glad you got involved with the HOA board?" Emma asked as we wound up the icicle lights. "Yeah, actually. It's more work than I expected, but it's also kind of satisfying. We're making decisions that affect the whole neighborhood, and most of the time, we're making things better. Even after everything that happened with that lady, especially after that whole situation showed me how important it is to have good people involved in community leadership. If I hadn't been paying attention, if I hadn't pushed back, who knows how far things could have gone?" Emma nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." We finished packing up and went inside. That evening, I got an email from Marcus with the agenda for the next board meeting. It was gratifyingly boring. Budget review, approval of landscaping contracts for the common areas, discussion of pool rules for the upcoming summer. Normal, mundane HOA business. Perfect. The board meeting 2 weeks later was equally uneventful. We approved everything on the agenda, discussed some minor resident concerns, and adjourned after just 45 minutes. As everyone filed out, Thomas Greenfield pulled me aside. "You know, I've been thinking about that whole situation with Brenda last year," he said. "From a legal perspective, we actually handled it pretty well. We followed proper procedures, we documented everything, and we didn't retaliate or do anything that could expose the HOA to liability. It could have gone very differently if we'd made different choices." I hadn't really thought about it from that angle. Most people don't, until something goes wrong. But good governance isn't just about making popular decisions. It's about having systems in place that prevent abuse and protect everyone involved. What we did by reforming the enforcement process and creating better oversight, that was good governance. I thought about that as I drove home. Thomas was right. The HOA could have handled Brenda's behavior in ways that would have made things worse. We could have retaliated against her. We could have violated her rights. We could have let the situation escalate into legal action against the HOA itself. Instead, we'd followed the rules, used the proper channels, and addressed the systemic issues that had allowed the problem to occur. That didn't make the experience pleasant, but it did make it meaningful. Spring came again, and with it, the annual cycle of HOA activities. The neighborhood garage sale, the pool opening, the 4th of July picnic. Emma graduated high school and prepared for college. Sarah's hospital recognized her with an award for excellence in nursing. I got promoted at work, which came with more responsibility but also better flexibility. At the annual HOA election in April, Marcus announced he was stepping down as president after 5 years in the role. The board nominated me to replace him, and the residents elected me by a comfortable margin. I was now president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. My first act as president was to appoint a task force to review all HOA policies and procedures, looking for any other areas where better oversight or clearer guidelines might be needed. The task force included Jennifer Walsh, Thomas Greenfield, and 3 residents who'd never been involved in HOA leadership before, but who had good ideas and a willingness to volunteer their time. Over the summer, the task force met monthly and produced a comprehensive report with recommendations. Most were minor tweaks, but a few were significant. They proposed creating term limits for committee chairs, requiring annual training for board members on HOA law and best practices, and establishing a formal community feedback process to ensure resident voices were heard. The board approved all the recommendations, and we began implementing them in the fall. It was a lot of work, but it felt important. We were building something better, learning from our mistakes and creating a stronger community. In November, I put up my winter decorations again. This year, I went even bigger, adding a light-up snowman family and synchronized music to go with the display. Everything was still within the guidelines, but it was definitely the most elaborate display on the block. The Whitman family from Brenda's old house came over one evening to admire the lights. Their kids were delighted by the music and danced in our front yard while the parents chatted with Sarah and me. "This is great," Mr. Whitman said. "We were worried when we moved here that the HOA might be really strict about decorations, but everyone seems to have such nice displays, and there's a lot of variety." "That's the goal," I said. "We want people to feel like they can express themselves while still maintaining some community standards. It's a balance." After they left, Sarah squeezed my hand. "You did a good thing, getting involved with all this. The neighborhood is lucky to have you." "I'm lucky to be here," I said, and I meant it. The year drew to a close, and I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened since that ridiculous fine notice had arrived on my doorstep. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but it had actually been less than 2 years. In that time, I'd gone from being a casual HOA committee member to being president of the board. I'd seen the worst and best of community governance. I'd learned about the importance of proper procedures, accountability, and the willingness to stand up when something was wrong. Most importantly, I'd learned that a community is only as strong as the people willing to invest time and energy into making it work. It's easy to complain about HOA rules or board decisions from the sidelines. It's much harder to actually get involved, to volunteer, to attend meetings, to serve on committees or the board itself. But that involvement matters. If I hadn't been paying attention, if I hadn't pushed back against Brenda's unauthorized enforcement, who knows what would have happened? Maybe the whole thing would have blown over anyway. Or maybe it would have gotten worse with more residents fined, more harassment, more damage. Instead, we dealt with it appropriately. We'd fixed the systemic issues. We'd created better policies. And we'd emerged as a stronger, more resilient community. On January 14th, I started taking down the decorations again, this time with a sense of satisfaction and completeness. Another season done, another year in the books. Emma would be leaving for college in the fall. Sarah was thriving at work. I was leading an HOA that functioned well and served its residents effectively. Life in Meadowbrook Heights had returned to normal, but it was a better normal than before. We'd learned our lessons and applied them. We turned a crisis into an opportunity for improvement. And when next November rolled around, I put up my decorations again, secure in the knowledge that they were properly approved, following all the correct guidelines, and contributing to a neighborhood that balanced individual expression with community standards. Because that's what a good HOA should do. Not control or restrict unnecessarily, but provide structure that enhances everyone's quality of life. Not give power to individuals who might abuse it, but create systems of accountability and oversight. Not react to problems defensively, but learn from mistakes and continuously improve. The fine notice that had started this whole saga was still filed away in my office, a reminder of how things could go wrong. But next to it now was a folder full of updated policies, training materials, and community feedback forms. A reminder of how we'd made things better. That seemed like a good place to end the story. Not with drama or conflict, but with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done and a community functioning the way it should. And if anyone ever tried to fine me for properly approved decorations again, well, I'd know exactly how to handle it.